Hi, everybody. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, Texas, on Thursday, May the 15th, and welcome to our commentary. Look, I think the big story in Washington, it doesn't get not getting a lot of attention, but it is a potentially very big story, is what's going on at the Supreme Court right now. Now, it's hard to tell. It's hard to tell from the questions and answers how the justices are going to vote. It's very difficult to tell because sometimes they're inquiring, they're asking questions, and you don't know how it's all going to turn out. The issue here is this birthright citizenship executive order that the White House wrote, or that President Trump wrote a few weeks ago. But that's not really what they're arguing about. What is really the discussion is really over these nationwide injunctions, where you have a district judge basically step up and write an opinion that stops an entire decision by the President of the United States. That's what the real issue is. That's what is being argued. And how it's going to go, I don't know. I was listening to Hugh Hewitt. I was listening to Jonathan Turley, the professor, and a few other people. And what seems to be clear is that there are four justices that we kind of know how they're going to vote. The four conservatives. We know they're going to vote against these nationwide injunctions. And then you've got the three liberals they're going to go with the nationwide injunction. So right now it's 4-3. So what's going to happen with the other two? Barrett and Roberts. Those are the two that seem to be not necessarily on the fence, but not real clear how they will come out, at least in the opinion of Hugh Hewitt and some of the others that I have been reading here in the last hour or so. So we'll have to wait and see how it goes. My expectation, or my hope, is that there's at least a 5-4 decision bringing an end to all of these nationwide injunctions. I think it's a travesty that one district judge can step up and basically make a decision for the entire nation. I mean, that's just ridiculous. I mean, that's why we have a Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court can write an opinion and say this is unconstitutional or you cannot do this. That's okay. I mean, that's what the court is for. But the idea that you have these district judges who are being selected by many of these groups, I mean, they're literally judge shopping, as they like to say, and they look for a judge and then they say, hey, give us this opinion. That just seems to me contrary to the best interest of justice. So I hope the Supreme Court will come down very hard on nationwide injunctions. That's what this is all about, nationwide injunctions. The whole issue of birthright citizenship, that's not going to come out of this case. That will ultimately have to go to the Congress and back to the Supreme Court. I happen to think that there are some questions regarding birthright citizenship as we do it today. Clearly, the 14th Amendment said one thing, but today I think it's been accepted that anybody born in the United States, regardless of your condition or legal status, is automatically a citizen. I don't believe that. I don't think that's what the 14th Amendment was about. But that's a technical point. That's a technical point that I hope the Supreme Court will address at some time down the future. But I think at this moment right now, what we would like to see the Supreme Court do is put an end to these nationwide injunctions and simply say no more of these injunctions, nationwide injunctions, and let's function a little bit better. If you want to take something to the courts, fine. You can file a lawsuit, go to the Supreme Court, go to the appellate courts or the circuit courts. But this idea, or through the attorney generals of the different states, I mean, that's another thing that can be done. But this idea that you have one district judge all of a sudden stopping something that the President of the United States is doing, if nothing else, it frankly takes up a lot of time and it confuses a lot of people. I mean, I'm totally confused as to how a judge in San Francisco, a district judge in San Francisco, for example, can tell the President of the United States, the commander-in-chief, how to run the U.S. Army. I don't understand where a district judge has the authority to tell the President of the United States, the commander-in-chief, how to run, the Army. And this is, of course, the transgender case that has been in the news. So hopefully this all comes to an end, and this Supreme Court will bring it to an end, because otherwise, it's going to get crazy. It's going to get crazy, and hopefully it'll come to an end with the Supreme Court saying no more of these nationwide injunctions. If you've got a problem with what the president is doing, there are other ways of bringing it to the attention of the country, but not through these district judges writing these nationwide injunctions. That's just absolutely, absolutely crazy. But again, you can never tell by the questions and answers how it's all going to turn out. I was listening to Hugh Hewitt, who I follow a lot on these situations. Jonathan Turley, the writer and professor, he's usually pretty good about these things. And I'm interested in hearing Professor Dershowitz. He has a podcast, and I'm going to try to listen to that later today and see his take on all of this. But anyway, it's a work in progress, and I'm not exactly sure when the Supreme Court is going to issue their opinion. Hopefully soon, because I think we need a resolution to this topic. I've got a post over at the American Thinker today talking about how all of a sudden people are lowering the expectations of a recession. We've had some good numbers come out, some good economic numbers on not just the retail inflation, but also the wholesale inflation. That one came out today. So it looks like the expectations for a recession are dropping. Now, what does that mean? Honestly, I don't know, and nobody else does either, because these are predictions about the future. And remember what Yogi Berra, the late Yogi Berra, said, that predicting the future is very difficult, or something like that he said, or predicting the future is not as easy as it used to be. Well, whatever he said. But I think he was telling us to be careful with making predictions, especially over the economy. I think people feel better about the economy. That's true. And that may be the reason why many of these houses, financial houses, are dropping the expectations of a recession. We'll have to wait and see. We'll have to wait and see how it all comes down and how everything falls into place. I personally didn't think there was going to be a recession, but again, what do I know? That's just a feeling that I had, because I never thought these tariffs were going to be around for such a long time, because I always thought it was a negotiation tactic by President Trump. He was simply negotiating with these countries, getting a better deal, and then having the commerce back to where it used to be, but just with more favorable situation for the United States. That's what I always thought it was. That's why I never expected these tariffs to be around in 6 months. In fact, I'd be surprised if they're around by Labor Day, because I think most of the countries are going to cut deals with the United States because they need to sell in the United States. And frankly, many of these countries, from what you read, were wondering why it was so easy to sell in the United States compared to Americans, selling in their country. The classic example is South Korea. They can sell their cars here, but try buying an American car in South Korea. It's a lot more complicated than buying a South Korean car in the United States. Well, President Trump's trip to the Middle East is going very well. People can nitpick about this and that. As I said yesterday, I don't like the idea of the airplane. I think that raises questions, not so much constitutional questions, because it's not a gift to him, but still the idea that we have to get a plane from whatever, it just makes me uncomfortable. My real question is, why isn't the manufacturer of the 747, who I believe is the Boeing company, why are they so far behind in making a presidential plane? That really puzzles me as to what's going on with that, because we should have had that plane years ago. I mean, apparently the order was made actually during the first Trump administration. I believe that we ordered that plane, and here we are. The plane is still, I guess, in the shop. It hasn't been finished yet. And that's not good. We have to have a plane. The president needs a new plane. And right now he's flying on a 747. I think that the first President Bush inaugurated back in what would have been the early 90s, 1991. I mean, that's a long time. We need a more modern plane, or a newer plane, if I could put it that way, for the president of the United States. I have a post coming out tomorrow about Europe, and you may have heard that this lady named Ursula, her last name is always very complicated to pronounce, but she's the head of the European Union. And she's basically coming out saying, hey, we got to spend more money on defense. And we're going to have to figure this out because we need to be better prepared for war. Because right now we're not, which is true. A lot of these European countries do not have enough armaments or enough weapons. And frankly, most of them don't have an army right now that could stand up to an adversary at times of war. And that's because they've gotten used to being protected by the United States. I mean, that's just the bottom line. NATO has protected many of these countries, but many of these countries have not paid up what they're supposed to pay. Now, it looks like that's changing, which is good. More and more countries are beginning to realize that they got to put up the 2% or whatever it is that they have to pay. But that doesn't mean they're ready for a war if one were to happen tomorrow. In fact, most of these countries are significantly underprepared. So the head of the European Union, this lady, Ursula von, I cannot pronounce her last name, but I think you know who I'm talking about. This lady is saying, hey, we got to do this. We got to spend more money. We got to get the financing and we got to do this because we need more defense. And she's exactly right. Europe needs to be better able to defend itself. They've relied on the United States too long. And, you know, at some point we have the right to say, hey, how much longer are we going to defend you for free? You know, we got our own problems. We got our own problems and we have our own financial issues. And how much longer can we continue to defend these countries that apparently don't want to defend themselves? That's the other issue. They're not willing to spend any money. So hopefully that's turning around. Hopefully that's turning around. And when you have this lady who's the head of the European Union saying, hey, we got to spend more money, hopefully that's a good sign that they're going to start building their own weapons and their own systems and so on in case of a war. I mean, that's what you have to do. Remember that quote by then President George Washington, who said that the best way to have peace is to be prepared for war. It's exactly right. And that's the message that has to go to Europe. Well, let me tell you a little quick history on this day in history. 1972, May 15th, 1972, George Wallace was running for president. Now, Wallace had run as an independent in 1968. He got 14% of the vote, and he carried like 4 or 5 southern states. So he was a real factor in helping Richard Nixon get elected in 1968. In 1972, he was running as a Democrat, which he had always been a Democrat back in Alabama when he was governor. And on this day in 1972, he was shot at a shopping center in Maryland. He was campaigning and somebody shot him. Now, thankfully, they didn't kill him, but I think he became disabled because of the wound and was never able to walk again. I think he continued running for president. Obviously didn't win the nomination, the Democrat nomination that went to George McGovern. But I do remember the speech that he gave at the Democrat convention back in 1972. You know, a pretty strong speech against what was going on in the Democrat Party, you know, the beginning of woke, if you will, that hurt the Democrat Party so much, and especially that year with George McGovern. So George Wallace was shot, I guess that's 53 years ago today, when he was campaigning. And that had an impact on the 1972 election because without Wallace, you know, Nixon was able to carry all of the South and honestly pick up all of the conservative votes. Many of them would have gone to George Wallace as they did in 1968. So George Wallace was shot on this day in 1972. And you talk about an assassination having an impact on the election. That one did, without question. It really did. Well, thank you for listening. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, and we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye, everybody.